Hello and welcome to the video. This is an introduction and overview of ExpressLRS or ELRS. That's the module that is in the back of this older radio here, and also the receiver that's actually built into this little quadcopter. But I have been playing with this for quite a while. I got these modules in a while back. I did a video. And I've only got it all working within about the past 5 or 6 days. And I didn't want to make a video talking about the challenges that I was having because lots of other people have done that. I thought I'd wait until the product had matured a little bit in terms of the integration between the new hardware like this and the project itself, so that I could kind of talk about some of the gotchas, how-tos, tips and tricks, and also cover for those of you that are brand new to this subject or just haven't really delved into it a lot yet, what ELRS or ExpressLRS actually is. Now, if you've been using ExpressLRS for quite a while, none of this is going to be new to you. This is really aimed at those pilots out there that are trying to figure out what it's all about. So first of all, let's talk about what ExpressLRS actually is. It is one of those fantastic open source projects that we rely on in the hobby. Things like iNav, Betaflight, the multi-protocol module projects. All of these projects come about by some incredibly smart people coding up technology and allowing us to use it for free, essentially. ExpressLRS is one of the latest versions of that. It's actually been around for a long time, but it only recently turned into version 1.0, and as I'm recording this, I'm on version 1.1, and the latest version of the configurator you can put on your computer is about 1.0.7, and that seems to have fixed a huge amount of issues, and it definitely fixed the outstanding ones for me. Now don't worry about all that stuff, we'll get into it in a minute. But having an open source project means that this software is available to download for free, and it doesn't only run on technology like this, you know, things like the Beta FPV modules, which one that I've got here. It also runs on a lot of legacy hardware, things like the R9M modules from FreeSky. So you don't have to necessarily buy anything new. You can flash it on stuff that you've already got and give it a new lease of life. Particularly interesting for me, for radios like this that are really supporting AWCST version 1, won't support the latest protocols from FreeSky, but actually sticking this module on the back gives it an entire new lease of life. Speaking of the modules, they're available in lots of different frequencies. 2.4, 868 and 915. They're not interchangeable. Well, at the moment, modules that I'm seeing aren't interchangeable, but the way it works is that you can either buy the 2.4 one or the 915 or the 868 one, and you're kind of stuck with it. So make sure you buy the right ones. You also need the receiver for the right frequency as well. So other systems that tend to use the lower wavelengths like 915, 868 tend to be things like your Crossfire, the R9M, those kind of technologies. But actually the range out of these systems is proving to be very, very good. And you can change the power levels on them. You can also change the speed that the unit communicates with the radio. Now, it's using a technology to talk to the radio and to talk to the flight controller inside the model that we first saw from Team Black Sheep, developed by TBS. It's called CRSF. Now, CRSF has been around for a long time. Checking with Trappy, it appears that the CRSF that the system uses hasn't been licensed from TBS. It has been reverse engineered. But that's a really good thing because CRSF is a really bulletproof protocol. It's incredibly fast, it's incredibly resilient, and it's also two-way. So that also means that you can get the telemetry down over the ELRS link down to your radio 2. Handy for things like iNav and other stuff, and also even things like Ardu Pilot these days that support CRSF and pumping back telemetry over it. Now, there are two ways to set up your radio and your model to bind together. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but this is something that confused me initially. There's a way where you can set it up without something called a passphrase. That's like the password on your Wi-Fi network at home, you know, the one that you put in your router, and every time you connect to it with a new device, it asks you for that password. The passphrase is kind of that for ExpressLRS. If you have it set up on your radio and you have it with the same passphrase set up on your receiver, they'll just automatically find each other and bind and talk to each other. If there's no passphrase stored on them, then you can go through a process to put the receiver into bind mode and then go through the bind process with a module on your radio and bind to it, which is kind of the traditional way that we tend to do it. You know, you kind of put your receiver into bind mode, put your radio into bind mode, there's a couple of beeps and away you go. You cannot interchange between the two. It's an either or other. You can reflash and change the settings on either end, but I have decided for my testing to not use a passphrase, but using a passphrase means that you don't have to go through that separate bind stuff. So just be aware of that. Now, I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Also make sure that if you're interested in this stuff, heartily recommend to go and read these pages. I'll put a link down below to this website. It kind of explains everything that I'm going to go through, and it does seem to be getting an awful lot more robust with these new radio systems, so it is a little bit easier and is more like the experience that I expected when I got this stuff back a couple of weeks ago. Now, as I said, the big difference for me with some of the struggling that I've had over the past 3 weeks has been the release of version 1.1 and the configurator app that you use on your PC to flash the software or the firmware onto the receiver and the transmitter is now on version 1.0.7, and that has made a massive difference. So a lot of the things that you may have been seeing on other places on YouTube and the forums with maybe people struggling, it doesn't seem to be people struggling with the older stuff that people have been testing the technology on for a long time, things like the FR Sky R9M. It all seems to revolve around the new hardware and kind of getting all the wrinkles out between the interface inside between the hardware and the firmware that you're flashing on it. Also appears that some of the hardware hasn't done everything exactly to the specs that ELRS published. There are some weird things. This beta FPV module, mine flashes okay actually, but some people have to take the case off. There's a little button you have to press to put it into bind mode because they missed a capacitor. Mine works fine, but lots of people have had that. Also had quite a few issues with the receiver that's built into the flight controller on these flight controllers from beta FPV. Previous versions of flashing on it just seemed to really upset it, and there was some tricks in the later versions of ELRS to get it to reflash to the latest version and get it all working, but I'll cover all that in a moment. So there are happy model radios. There's the beta FPV ones which I've got. There's also the Namimo, not sure how you say that. I've got those radios on the way as well to play with, because this is a project that I'm really interested in as I move away from the FreeSky ACCST version 1 stuff that's kind of no longer supported, but I personally had quite a big investment in. Now, the application that updates this stuff is the ELRS configurator. You can download it and install it onto your computer, and this application is the one that you need to navigate through to update your radios and your receiver. You tell it which kind of radio you have, which kind of receiver you have, which version of the software you want, and which way you want to flash it. Now, there are 3 options, 3 ways that you can flash the technology. Now, the first one is via a UART. So if you connect something like an FTDI adapter onto the receiver and you do it like that, then that's one way to do it. Quite complicated if you're not technically minded. However, if you have the receiver already connected and configured via CRSF on your flight controller, then you can use something called Betaflight pass-through. And what that does is it basically tells Betaflight to act like a dumb FTDI adapter and then just pushes the update through Betaflight onto the receiver. That's the way I've been doing it here. The third and final way is very clever. If nothing happens with a receiver for 20-30 seconds, the little light on these just flashes like crazy and it creates a Wi-Fi access point. You can connect to that and then actually do the update over Wi-Fi. That's completely wireless. You don't need a cable at all for that. Very, very clever indeed. You also need to download a script onto your radio. There's a Lua script that runs on this, which then you can use to configure everything, select your bind, put things into Wi-Fi. You can do the bind on these ones. There's actually a little button on these particular modules. I think most of them have them. But having the Lua script also allows you to select the speeds and things like that as well. Just be aware that you'll probably need a pretty recent version of OpenTX. This was running something like OpenTX 2.2.1. I hadn't used this for ages, just because. And when I put the Lua script on here, although it would start, it wouldn't really allow me to navigate through it. I updated to the latest version of OpenTX and it's working brilliantly. So just be aware of that if you're going to pull out an old radio to try with ELRS. So a couple of tips about what ELRS actually is. The first big thing to note is at the moment, the first 4 channels that it sends to your receiver and your model are kind of full resolution. You know, your throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, or whichever order you have them in. That's perfect for flying. However, auxiliary channel 1 or channel 5 has to be for your arming switch. You have to use it that way. And then the other channels are only really there for switches. They're not really designed to have full resolution. Now this is very different from lots of other radio systems that are out there. Looking at the wiki, there is work to add more full resolution channels, which actually I would really like. It would allow you then to do things like pan and tilt, have you know, flap channels and all kinds of other cool things. At the moment, ELRS is kind of great if you're using flight controllers and you don't need a lot of full range channels. So just be aware of that. This isn't right now the answer if you need 8 full range channels or even 5 full range channels, but fingers crossed, hopefully that's on its way. Other big tip I'll give you, if using Betaflight pass-through, as I've just described, to flash the receiver, initially that worked fine on the very first early beta versions, but I found as the technology has been updated, you have to connect to the model first, go into Betaflight, turn off telemetry in the configuration tab. You know, the place where you have things like air mode always turned on. Turn off telemetry and then the flashing will work. If telemetry is turned on, it just seems to mess up the timing. So that's a big tip. I need to say a big thank you to one of my friends who is an ELRS developer who kind of got in touch and kind of helped me figure that out. Do also make sure, of course, that you have a spare UART on your flight controller to configure CRSF. CRSF is a standard protocol that pretty much everyone's supported for a very long time, thanks to TBS for developing that. But you need to use a UART to do that. So make sure you have a spare UART if you're going to put an external receiver on and configure it with CRSF and have it all working. In terms of setup, that's pretty straightforward. First thing you need to do is read the documentation. Everything is in there and they're doing a really good job of maintaining and updating that. That kind of gives you exactly all the steps. So definitely sit down with a cup of coffee, cup of tea and read that before you attempt it. Download the configurator, put it onto your computer. Download the Lua script, put it onto your radio. Again, you might have to update your radio to the latest and greatest versions of OpenTX if the Lua script doesn't fire up and you're not able to navigate. Don't forget that you are selecting the connection for the external radio as CRSF on your radio, and you're going to select and connect your receiver potentially to your flight controller using a spare UART, and you're going to configure that as CRSF just like you would do for something like Crossfire. Once you've got those two things done, then you can update the transmitter and receiver using the bits and pieces from the ELRS configurator. Everything has a little USB port. So this one has one on there. I would personally use USB first of all. I use Windows 10 and the drivers just did it all. I didn't have to worry about it. So start configurator and then go down and select the kind of radio that you have. So this is a Beta FPV 2.4 gig. Select the version of ELRS that you want and then go and flash it. Again, if you're using the pass-through mode, which is the one that I've been using here, which turns your Betaflight flight controller into an FTDI adapter, then don't forget to turn telemetry off. Then once they're both flashed with the same version of ExpressLRS and both flashed with either the same passphrase or no passphrase, then you bind them. If there's a passphrase on both, then they should find and talk to each other. If there isn't a passphrase, then there's quite a cute way to put the receiver into bind mode. You actually power cycle it 3 times on these ones. Check the manual for the hardware that you've got, but by power cycling it 3 times, it puts it into bind mode for the receiver. And then with radio powered, it's either pressing the button to activate a bind mode or run the Lua script, select bind, and it'll work. But it isn't all completely a bed of roses right now. As you've probably seen in some places, some of the newer hardware isn't getting everything right out of the gate. This is kind of version 1 of the hardware, and I'm sure there will be revisions over the coming months where they'll improve it. So for example, there is a small capacitor that's missing off the inside of this, which means that when you flash it, some people are having to take the case off and press a little button to kind of force it to accept the update. Mine is working fine. I don't have to do that, but that's one of those kind of niggly things that, you know what, that kind of should have been tested. And this is kind of one of the fun things about the project, is that right now, with all this new hardware that's been brought out for it, all those kind of gaps in between the hardware and the kind of firmware are all being sorted out. Similarly, you know, some of the weird stuff that I've had with some of the receivers is now all working, thank you to the updates from the ExpressLRS team. But it does mean that, you know, it's a little bit bleeding edge for some of the newer hardware, but it is now, from what I can see, all working nicely. Other big tip I'll give you is occasionally I've got in a situation when I've been updating. I've probably updated these 40-50 times over the last 4 weeks trying to get all this stuff working. Occasionally I can get in a situation where it will always fail. The first time you go to do an update, it takes a long time to download, compile and link the firmware based on the settings that you've told it, and then flash it onto the receiver. So if it's taking ages, don't worry about that. But occasionally it will fail, give you a big red alert to tell you that something bad has happened, or hasn't happened, more to the point. And sometimes, even after I've kind of figured out how to make it work all the time, I've had that happen. And then closing everything down, rebooting the computer, and then trying again seems to fix it. So I don't know if there's something, I don't know, in a cache or a temporary file or something that gets upset when you've been playing and flashing stuff for a long time. So my big tip is, if you really get stuck and you're doing it and this kind of worked 15 minutes ago, I would probably just bounce your computer, reboot it, and just have another go. I need to say a big thank you to the ExpressLRS team. They have been spectacular in providing support and answering the questions and trying to help me figure this out. Much better than the hardware vendors, but I think the hardware vendors are just kind of getting to grips with this stuff, while the ELRS developers obviously have been living with it for a long time and kind of know a lot of the tips and tricks. And it's thanks to those guys that things like the latest version of ExpressLRS 1.1 and the configurator are kind of making this stuff so I can flash it and use it, which is fantastic. And I'm sure that over the next couple of months there will continue to be lots of updates and fixes as people try different things with, you know, maybe radios from Beta FPV, receivers from other manufacturers. There'll be all kind of little wrinkles found as we as a community really start to put this stuff through our paces and do stuff that the developers never thought anyone would be crazy enough to try. So I will be keeping an eye on the updates, and any big updates I will make a video. So looking forward, this is a really exciting project. It means that we now have a vendor independent technology that even if you have older radios that are no longer really supported by the vendors kind of give up on them, it doesn't really matter. You get a module, you stick it on the back, and then you get the receivers from whoever, and away you go. Hopefully it'll avoid the situation I had where my big investment in AWCST version 1 FreeSky stuff was pretty much thrown on the scrap heap by the vendor, which now means that I've been looking for something to replace it with, and this could be the answer. It could also become a default protocol for lots of manufacturers of kit. Rather than have lots of different options for your receiver, they could start to see maybe more flight controllers with ELRS receivers built in. Now the ELRS antennas on this are quite dinky. They're the little white ones at the front, but there are little kind of hard, I'm not sure if they're ceramic ones, little small cubes. So the receivers themselves are incredibly small, and it does mean that the all-in-one boards from people like Beta FPV do make a very, very neat installation for toothpicks, because literally everything apart from the VTX is on there. The ESCs, the flight controller, the ELRS receiver, it's kind of all ready to go. You just plug in your FPV system of choice and your motors, stick it on a frame, and you're good to go. I do hope that the project remains viable in the future. One of the things that I've noticed talking to a couple of the devs is the hardware guys who are actually developing and selling the hardware and making the money from those sales don't appear to be commercially tied back to the project to support it and make sure that it continues. And while projects get a lot of love in the early days while they're exciting and sexy and new and interesting and fun for the developers to work on, over time that becomes more laborious. It's kind of code maintenance, documentation updates, bug fixes. It would be good to make sure that there is some system in place to make sure that this as a project is something we're using in 5, 8, 10 years time. So hopefully that's interesting for those of you that have been looking at ELRS. The good news is with the latest updates, it's all kind of working. And also with having an open protocol like this that isn't owned by any of the vendors, just gives us potentially an awful lot of freedom and choice. Thank you for spending your time today watching that video. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you're trying to learn about a subject, then check out the playlist. All of my videos are organized into easy to follow playlists that if you're trying to learn a topic will take you from the basics right the way through to some pretty advanced stuff.